The lockdown order slammed through the radio like a hammer. Gates secured, effective immediately. The red arm dropped in front of me and locked. Floodlights burned white against the asphalt. The two guards moved at the same time, calm and automatic. One widened his stance, boots grinding into the gravel, shoulders squaring. The other stepped into my space, close enough that I could smell oil and dust on his gear. His hand didn't grab his weapon, but it hovered inches from the holster. That was the warning. Stop here. I froze with my hands open. 5 miles down the road, a resupply convoy was already moving, engines warm, drivers trusting an escort that hadn't linked up yet. If I didn't get through this gate, they would hit the bend near the dry wash at 2 o'clock in the morning without cover. Everyone on base knew that stretch. Narrow, quiet, unforgiving. The guard took my identification, checked it once, and handed it back without a word. No argument, no apology. Behind the barrier, his partner turned away and keyed the radio, voice low. Wind pushed diesel fumes across the checkpoint. A generator coughed, then settled. The radio crackled. The guard stiffened. "Stand by," he said, "not to me." My pulse hammered. Every second here was another length of road driven blind. Arguing would get me on the ground. Fighting would get someone hurt. I took one measured step back and reached for my phone. Whatever that call was about to be, it wasn't for them. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. By the time that night arrived, the tension had already been building for days. I wasn't a stranger to that base or to the people running it. I'd been assigned there long enough to understand its rhythms, the way things usually moved, and the way they changed when something wasn't right. In 2014, my role sat in an awkward space between operations and coordination. I wasn't a gate guard, and I wasn't sitting safely behind a desk either. My job was to move information and timing between people who didn't always talk to each other, especially when pressure started to rise. The base itself sat outside a small town most people would miss if they blinked while driving past. One main road, a handful of closed storefronts, open land stretching out in every direction. It wasn't famous, and it wasn't meant to be. What mattered was what passed through it and when. Convoys staged there. Units rotated through quietly. When things worked, nobody noticed. When they didn't, the consequences traveled far beyond the fence line. Earlier that week, security posture had shifted without much explanation. Briefings shortened. Slides skipped details. Timelines blurred. One officer would emphasize caution and restricted movement. Another would talk about maintaining normal operations as long as possible. Both carried rank. Neither explained how those orders were supposed to fit together. Radios stayed quieter than usual, like everyone was waiting for someone else to say the wrong thing first. By mid-afternoon, the signs were impossible to ignore. Phones rang and went unanswered. Officers walked fast through hallways, eyes down, conversations stopping the moment someone new stepped in. Meetings ended early with phrases like, "We'll reassess later." No one raised alarms, but no one projected confidence either. It felt like a decision had been postponed, not resolved, and the weight of it was starting to slide downhill. What made it worse was what I already knew. A resupply convoy was scheduled to move that night along a route everyone pretended was safe because nothing had happened there recently. 5 miles of road that cut through open ground and dipped near a dry wash before climbing back toward the highway. It was the kind of place you didn't want to be predictable, especially without an escort. The plan on paper assumed coordination that hadn't happened yet. The escort element was delayed, and the window to fix that was shrinking. I raised the concern the way I was trained to. Calmly, through the right channels, I asked whether the convoy timeline was still accurate. I pointed out the gap between the movement order and the security posture we'd just adopted. The answers came back measured and vague. "We're tracking it. Stand by. Follow protocol." No one told me I was wrong. No one told me to act either. It was easier to let procedure run its course than to interrupt it. That's how these situations usually go. Responsibility diffuses upward until it disappears. Everyone follows the rules, and later, when things go bad, the paperwork proves it. I'd seen it happen before. Waiting feels safe because it doesn't leave fingerprints. Acting does. As evening set in, the bass took on that muted tone it gets when something is about to happen but hasn't yet. Exterior lights came on early. Patrols doubled without announcement. Radios switched channels quietly. When the lockdown notice came through sooner than expected, it didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how final it sounded, like a door closing on options that hadn't been fully considered. Once lockdown was declared, the rules were absolute. No movement without clearance. No exceptions at the gate. Guards weren't there to judge intent or weigh risk. Their job was to stop everyone equally. I respected that. I'd stood on the other side of that barrier earlier in my career, enforcing orders I didn't write and couldn't change. But I also knew what was still moving beyond the fence. Engines turning over. Drivers following a timeline that hadn't been updated. Miles of road ticking by. Standing there under the lights later that night, walking toward the checkpoint, I already understood how likely it was that I would be denied. I approached anyway, not because I expected sympathy, but because I knew that if nothing changed, the convoy would roll into a bad stretch of road without the protection it was supposed to have. Waiting until morning would be clean. It would also be too late. The warning signs had been there all day if you knew how to look for them. The morning briefing ended 10 minutes early, which never happened unless someone didn't want questions. Slides jumped from overview to conclusion without filling in the space between. When someone asked about timelines, the answer came back soft and unfinished. Still developing. Heads nodded. Pens stopped moving. That was the first crack. By late morning, the instructions stopped matching. One message said, "Restrict movement." Another said, "Keep traffic flowing." Both carried authority. Neither explained which one mattered more. Phones rang. No one answered. When they did, the calls were short and careful, like every word was being weighed against a future report. People walked fast through the corridors, eyes on the floor, conversations dying the moment a door opened. The radios were worse. Not loud, not busy. Quiet in the wrong way, long gaps. Then a burst of static and a clipped check-in that said nothing useful. Silence again. That kind of quiet doesn't mean calm. It means everyone is waiting for someone else to make the first mistake. I watched command officers move through the building, distracted, half present. Meetings started late and ended early. Laptops closed without conclusions. Phrases like, "We'll circle back," floated through the air and settled nowhere. No one wanted to be the person who forced a decision before all the information arrived. The problem was, the information never arrived all at once. It never does. By early afternoon, the sense of delay started to press in on me. Not panic, pressure. The kind that builds when you realize time is slipping and no one is adjusting the plan to match it. I pulled up the convoy schedule again. Same route, same departure window. No update to the escort timeline. 5 miles of exposed road that everyone pretended was routine because it usually was. I raised the issue again, this time more directly. I pointed out the gap between the security posture we were adopting and the movement order that was still active. I didn't argue. I didn't dramatize it. I just laid the facts out and waited. The response came back calm and procedural. "Stand by, we're monitoring, follow the established process." No one said no. No one said yes. The decision dissolved into the structure around it. As the afternoon wore on, the base felt like it was holding its breath. Vehicles returned earlier than usual. Exterior lights flicked on before sunset. Patrols doubled quietly. Radios shifted channels without explanation. These weren't overreactions. They were signals, the kind you feel more than see. I checked the time more often than I meant to. Each hour that passed narrowed the window. Delays stack quietly. A late escort becomes a missed escort. A missed escort becomes a convoy on its own. Once that happens, no one wants to be the one who admits it should have been stopped. The hardest part wasn't the uncertainty. It was the comfort people took in procedure. As long as the rules were being followed, no one felt personally responsible for what might happen next. The system would absorb the outcome, whatever it was. I'd watched that happen before. I'd watched reports get written that explained everything and answered nothing. By early evening, the radio traffic thinned even more. When voices did come through, they were tense and minimal. Call signs, acknowledgments, nothing else. I knew then that if the plan changed, it wouldn't be because someone had finally gotten clarity. It would be because something forced their hand. I ran through the options in my head, looking for a reason to step back. A justification to tell myself that waiting was acceptable. I didn't find one. The picture stayed incomplete, and the gaps mattered. The announcement came without buildup. Lockdown effective immediately. Gate secured. Movement restricted. The words were clean and final. Around me, people adjusted without comment. Doors closed. Radios switched channels. The base settled into a controlled stillness. I stood there for a moment after the transmission ended, listening to the quiet that followed. The unease that had been building all day finally had a name. The rules were about to do exactly what they were designed to do. The question was whether they still fit the situation they were meant to control. The guards didn't soften when I asked again. They didn't need to. The words came back exactly as written, delivered in the same calm tone as before. Lockdown in effect. No movement without clearance. Orders stand until lifted. It wasn't personal. It was procedure, and procedure was doing its job. I asked for verification, not to challenge them, but to force the system to speak. One guard keyed his radio and waited. Static hissed. He tried a second channel, then a third. Each time the response was the same, nothing. He lowered the radio and looked at me, expression neutral, caught between doing exactly what he was told and knowing that something beyond the gate wasn't waiting on protocol to catch up. Time moved in small, grinding increments. The floodlights buzzed. The night air pressed colder against my face. Engines idled longer than they should have, then shut off, then started again somewhere beyond the fence. Movements I couldn't see but could feel. I checked the time once, then forced myself to stop. Watching the clock only made the wait heavier. I asked if a supervisor had acknowledged the lockdown recently. Sometimes confirmation alone changes posture. The guard shook his head. No update. No new traffic. The chain of command had gone quiet at the worst possible moment. When that happens, the responsibility doesn't vanish. It slides downward, settling on whoever is closest to the problem. Beyond the gate, conditions were shifting. Radios that had gone quiet earlier now stayed quiet longer. That wasn't calm. That was activity happening elsewhere, pulling attention away. I replayed the route in my head, the narrow stretch near the dry wash, the blind curve where headlights disappear for a few seconds longer than they should. The convoy was already on the move. Every minute I stood there was another mile driven without the escort that was supposed to be in place. The guards stayed disciplined. No raised voices, no unnecessary movement. One of them adjusted his stance slightly, boots digging in. The other rested his hand closer to his gear, not threatening, just ready. The physical reality of the standoff sharpened. This wasn't an abstract delay anymore. This was distance measured in steps and seconds. I tried one more angle. Asked if there was any alternate channel, any direct line that hadn't been saturated yet. The answer was the same. Everything routed through the same system. Everything waited for someone higher to notice the problem and decide to own it. Until then, the order stood. That's when the frustration tightened into something more controlled. Not anger. Focus. I thought about the conversations earlier in the day, the way decisions had been deferred with professional language and calm voices. No one had been wrong. No one had been decisive either. The system was working exactly as designed, and that design didn't account for what was happening in real time. I weighed the options without pretending there were more than two. If I waited, the paperwork would be clean. The explanation would be simple. Lockdown enforced. No unauthorized movement. If something went wrong later, it would be explained in passive voice. If I acted, there would be questions, names attached, timelines scrutinized. The difference was ownership. The guards watched me carefully now, not suspicious, just alert. They could sense the shift. People in uniform learn to read that moment when someone is about to make a decision that changes the situation. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Their presence alone reminded me that any move I made would ripple outward and land on more people than just me. I stepped back from the barrier and took a slow breath, feeling the cold settle deeper into my chest. Waiting had felt reasonable earlier. Standing there now, with the night stretching on and the road beyond the gate growing more dangerous by the minute, waiting felt like avoidance dressed up as discipline. I knew what would happen if I did nothing. I also knew what it would cost if I acted and turned out to be wrong. The choice settled quietly, without drama. Procedure had reached its limit. Waiting was no longer acceptable, and if something was going to change, it would have to start with me. I stepped back from the barrier so the guards wouldn't feel like I was forcing their hand. Distance mattered. It kept this from turning into a scene they would have to answer for later. I moved just far enough that the floodlights weren't in my eyes, and the red arm sat between us like a line that didn't want to be crossed. My hand stayed visible. Calm reads safer than confidence at a gate. I pulled my phone out and felt the weight of it settle into my palm. I didn't scroll. I didn't hesitate. I typed the name I had been hoping I wouldn't need tonight, checked it once, and pressed call. The ring sounded too loud in the open air, each tone stretching out as if the night itself were listening. I kept my eyes forward, breathing steady, aware of the guard's peripheral attention without inviting it. When the call connected, I didn't ease into it. I confirmed who I had, then spoke plainly. Lockdown had been declared. Communication was degraded. A resupply convoy was already rolling along a route that assumed an escort that had not linked up. The bend near the dry wash would be reached at 2 o'clock in the morning. Without coverage, that stretch turned from routine to risk. I stated where I was, what I was being denied, and why waiting until morning would not solve the problem. No background, no adjectives. Just facts in sequence. Then I stopped talking. Silence on the line stretched, heavy and deliberate. I could hear breathing, slow and controlled, the sound of someone pulling pieces together. I didn't fill the space. Filling space feels helpful, but it dilutes authority. The information had landed. Anything more would only soften it. Out of the corner of my eye, one of the guards glanced my way. Not curiosity. Recognition. He'd caught the name I'd said when the call started. It wasn't fear that crossed his face, just awareness that the situation had moved beyond the simple edges of procedure. He didn't change his stance, but his attention sharpened. The other guard noticed and mirrored him, body squared, readiness maintained without escalation. The voice on the line came back with short questions, precise and unadorned. Timeline. Route confirmation. Escort status. I answered each one cleanly. I didn't speculate. I didn't argue intent. I laid out consequences the way you do when you've watched them unfold before and don't need to dramatize them. A convoy without cover doesn't fail all at once. It bleeds options mile by mile. Everyone who's been around long enough understands that math without hearing it explained. Another pause followed, longer this time. I imagined the person on the other end replaying earlier conversations from the day, the ones that had felt safe to defer at the time. Recognition doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly and stays. I kept my posture neutral, phone steady, eyes forward. The guards stood where they were, disciplined and still, creating a physical boundary that reminded me exactly where I was and how little room there was to maneuver. I added one more sentence, carefully chosen. Not a threat. Not a plea. A projection. If nothing changed in the next few minutes, the escort would not make the link-up window. After that, stopping the convoy would be the only responsible option, and that would have its own consequences. I let that sit and stopped speaking again. The line stayed open. The night pressed in. Engines beyond the fence idled and cut out, then started again. Somewhere, a driver checked a watch. Somewhere else, a radio stayed quiet, a beat too long. I was acutely aware that whatever happened next would attach itself to names and timestamps, mine included. Finally, the voice returned, lower now, not softer, deliberate. I was told to stay where I was and keep my phone on. No promises. No confirmation. Just that. It wasn't reassurance, but it wasn't dismissal either. I acknowledged the instruction and ended the call without adding anything that might blur it. The screen went dark. For a moment, nothing changed. The barrier stayed down. The guards didn't move. The base beyond the fence remained unresolved. I slid the phone back into my pocket and returned to the line, hands visible, posture calm. The adrenaline hadn't spiked yet. It sat coiled, waiting for an outcome. I knew then that I had crossed the point of clean explanations. From here on, things would either align or they wouldn't, and either way, the choice would be traceable. That was the cost of making the call. I accepted it and stood under the lights, letting the night decide whether I had said enough. The waiting settled in after the call, thick and unmoving. Not the kind that buzzes with noise, but the kind that presses down and makes every sound feel too loud. The guards stayed where they were, bodies squared, attention sharpened. They weren't frozen. They were poised, like everything had narrowed to a few square feet of asphalt and a handful of decisions already made somewhere else. Radio traffic picked up, but not in a way that brought clarity. Short transmissions cut in and out, call signs repeated, acknowledgments returned without detail. It felt like listening to the edge of a conversation you weren't meant to hear. Every voice carried restraint, each word chosen carefully, as if everyone suddenly understood that whatever they said might be replayed later. The background hum of the bass shifted in response, engines starting and stopping, a distant vehicle rolling and then idling again. Movement without momentum. The floodlights hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. Insects traced tight circles in the light, drawn in and pushed away over and over. I focused on that for a moment, anything to keep my breathing even. The night air was colder now, or maybe I was just noticing it. I could feel the chill settling into my chest, slowing everything down. Adrenaline hadn't hit yet. It hovered, waiting for permission. I ran through consequences again, not as a spiral, but as a checklist. If nothing changed, I would be logged. Questions would follow. There would be a review, quiet and thorough. Someone would ask why I didn't wait. Someone else would point to the order and say it was clear. If things went wrong beyond the gate, the explanation would be clean on paper and hollow in reality. I had made peace with that outcome the moment I dialed the number. Responsibility doesn't wait for comfort. The guards exchanged another brief glance. One adjusted his earpiece, listening harder now. The other shifted his weight, boots settling into the gravel. Their hands stayed close to their gear, not threatening, just ready. It struck me how much discipline lives in moments like this, when there's nothing to do but hold your ground and trust that someone else is carrying their end of the weight. No one spoke unless it was necessary. When the radio crackled, everyone listened. When it went quiet again, no one rushed to fill the space. Silence stopped being awkward and became intentional. This was what it looked like when procedure reached the edge of its usefulness and waited for judgment to catch up. I thought about the convoy again, picturing the stretch of road in my head. Headlights cutting through darkness. The curve near the wash where radios sometimes dipped. Drivers checking mirrors, trusting the plan they'd been given. They wouldn't know anything had changed until it mattered. That image sharpened my focus more than any fear could have. The stakes were out there now, moving mile by mile, indifferent to whether we resolved things here in time. Another transmission came through, routed differently than the others. A name repeated twice, slowly, for emphasis. One of the guards straightened a fraction, recognizing the authority behind it. He didn't move yet. He just listened, jaw set, eyes forward. The other guard mirrored him without being told. Training compresses into moments like that, when bodies respond before thoughts fully form. I stayed where I was, resisting the urge to step closer or say anything. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. My part had already been played. Anything I added now would only muddy the water. Waiting, at this point, wasn't passive. It was the final test of whether the system could respond in time. The radio hissed, then cleared. More voices joined, careful and controlled. I could feel the night leaning in, the way it does right before something breaks or resolves. The hum of the lights seemed louder. The air felt heavier. My hands trembled once, just enough that I noticed, then steadied again. The adrenaline was starting to move, slow and inevitable. Seconds stretched, then minutes. The base beyond the fence remained unseen but not unfelt. Every sound carried farther. Every pause meant more than it should have. I didn't look at the guards. I didn't check the time. I focused on staying present, ready to accept whatever came next without flinching. The tone on the radio changed, subtle but unmistakable. The command channel cut cleanly through the background noise, firm and focused. Other transmissions dropped away as if on cue. One of the guards reached for the volume control, adjusting it without being asked. The waiting ended in that instant, even before a single word was spoken. The instruction came through clean and unmistakable. Not loud, not urgent, just precise. A call sign, repeated once, followed by a directive that didn't invite interpretation. The guard acknowledged immediately, his response clipped and professional. When he lowered the radio, something in his posture changed. The firmness didn't disappear, but it shifted into caution, the kind that comes when the weight of an order is fully understood. He didn't look at me right away. His eyes went to the control panel, then back to the barrier, as if grounding himself in something physical before acting. The other guard noticed the change without a word. Years of shared training filled in the gaps faster than conversation ever could. This was no longer a routine enforcement of standing orders. This was an adjustment, and adjustments always carry risk. The air around the checkpoint felt different. Quieter, somehow, even with the radios active. Voices dropped lower. Movement slowed. Everything became deliberate. The kind of care people take when they know they're standing at the edge of something that can't be undone once it starts. Whatever authority had stepped in did so without spectacle, and that alone said enough. Gate protocol was overridden without explanation. No announcement went out. No lights flashed. No one nearby was told why the rules had changed, only that they had. The command channel stayed tight, insulated from curiosity. If anyone later asked when the order shifted, there would be a timestamp and a name attached to it. That was all the system required. I stayed where I was, hands relaxed at my sides, resisting the urge to say anything. This wasn't the moment for confirmation or thanks. The truth behind the call didn't need to be spoken aloud to be real. It had already reshaped the situation in ways that couldn't be walked back. The guard finally looked at me, not with suspicion, not with apology, just acknowledgement. A brief meeting of eyes that said he understood enough, even if he didn't know the full picture. He didn't ask who I'd called. He didn't ask why. Those questions belonged higher up the chain, where the consequences would land. He reached for the controls and paused for a fraction of a second. Not doubt, respect. Once the barrier moved, there would be no pretending this night had stayed within routine. The base would split into before and after, whether anyone chose to mark it that way or not. I thought about the person on the other end of the call, wherever they were now. The realization that settles in when deferred decisions come back demanding ownership. That moment doesn't announce itself with anger or noise. It arrives quietly and stays. Around us, nothing looked dramatic. Engines idled. Lights stayed steady. Anyone passing at a distance would have seen nothing more than a routine gate adjustment. That's how authority works when it's exercised properly. It doesn't draw attention to itself. It just changes outcomes. The guard keyed his radio one last time, confirming compliance. His voice was steady, unshaken. When he finished, his hand rested on the console, waiting for the mechanism to catch up with the decision already made. The motor engaged with a sharp metallic clack, louder than it had any right to be. The sound cut through the night like a signal. The barrier shuddered, then began to rise. I moved through the opening without breaking stride. The barrier finished lifting behind me with a hard mechanical snap, then settled into a steady whine as it locked overhead. The sound carried farther than it should have, echoing off concrete and steel, a reminder that something irreversible had just happened. I didn't look back at the guards as I passed, not out of disregard, but out of respect. They stayed where they were, eyes forward again, posture reset. When I glanced once in the side mirror, neither met my gaze. There was no hostility there, just professionalism and the shared understanding that their job had been done correctly, even as the rules bent. Inside the perimeter, the base looked unchanged at first glance. The same buildings, the same pools of light, the same quiet hum of generators and distant engines. From the outside, it would have been impossible to tell that anything had shifted. That illusion stayed with me as I drove deeper in, because I knew how close the night had come to unfolding along a different path. One decision at the gate had already altered a sequence of events. No one watching from afar would ever connect back to that moment. The task that brought me through didn't involve urgency in the cinematic sense. No alarms, no running, no raised voices. It was a series of conversations and confirmations that should have happened earlier, now compressed into a narrow window. I passed along the updated information, verified positions, and watched plans adjust quietly in response. People didn't ask why the timing had changed. They didn't need to. Experience filled in the gaps faster than explanations ever could. As I moved through the operations area, I caught fragments of low conversations, clipped sentences that stopped when I approached, not secrecy. Awareness. The kind that settles in when people realize how close they came to acting on incomplete information. No one congratulated me. No one treated what had happened as exceptional. That absence felt right. This wasn't about recognition. It was about alignment, about the system finally matching the reality on the ground. Later, away from the main flow of activity, the stakes were spoken aloud. A senior officer met with me briefly, not to question my judgment, but to understand the sequence. We walked through what had almost happened in plain terms. Not hypotheticals, not dramatics. Delays that would have compounded, a convoy that would have reached a critical stretch of road without the coverage it was supposed to have. Decisions that would have been forced under worse conditions with fewer options. The conversation stayed measured, but the weight behind every word was unmistakable. There was no blame assigned, no attempt to frame the night as a success story. It was understood for what it was, a near miss that had been redirected in time. Those are the moments that change how plans get written later, even if no one ever references the exact night that forced the lesson. The officer thanked me once, quietly, then moved on. There was work to do, and that mattered more than commentary. As the minutes passed, the base began to breathe again. Radios settled into a more regular rhythm. Movement became purposeful instead of constrained. The night resumed its routine as if it hadn't been interrupted. That's one of the military's quiet strengths. It absorbs disruption and carries on, often without leaving visible marks. I thought again about the guards at the checkpoint, how they had held the line until authority shifted, how they had adapted without complaint when it did. They hadn't been wrong. Neither had I. The situation had simply outgrown the procedure that first contained it. That distinction mattered to me more than any outcome. Too often, stories like this get flattened into right and wrong when the truth lives somewhere more complicated. By the time everything that needed doing was done, the adrenaline finally began to fade, not in a rush, but in a slow release that left me aware of how tightly I'd been holding myself together. My hands trembled slightly when I noticed them again, a delayed response to pressure that had nowhere else to go. I took a breath and let it pass. I made my way back toward the edge of the base as quietly as I'd entered. The checkpoint looked the same from the inside. The barrier was down again. The floodlights hummed. If someone had arrived fresh at that moment, they would never have guessed how close the night had come to tipping the wrong way. As I left the area, a familiar mix settled in. Relief that the worst hadn't happened, unease knowing how easily it still could have. Some moments announced themselves as turning points. Others slipped by unnoticed, leaving only the people who stood close enough to feel the weight of what almost went wrong. That checkpoint never left me, even after the base moved on. It wasn't because of the lights or the barrier or the tension in the air. It was because that thin stretch of asphalt became a line between outcomes, drawn quietly in the dark. On one side of it were explanations that would have sounded clean on paper. On the other were consequences that wouldn't have needed explaining at all. Nothing about the place marked it as important once the night was over, but I've learned that the most important moments rarely announce themselves. I think often about the guards who stood there with me. They weren't obstacles. They weren't villains. They were doing exactly what they had been trained to do, holding a line they didn't write and trusting that the system above them would carry its weight. When the order changed, they adjusted without complaint or confusion. That kind of discipline doesn't get celebrated, but it's what keeps everything from unraveling when pressure builds. Authority is easy to misunderstand. From the outside, it looks like power, like control exercised loudly and decisively. From the inside, it feels heavier than that. It feels like responsibility settling in when procedure runs out of room. It feels like knowing that silence can be just as consequential as action, and that waiting is still a decision you'll have to own later. By morning, the base returned to its routines. Schedules resumed. Radios carried new problems. The night folded into memory like so many others. But that moment at the gate stayed with me, a reminder that some decisions are made in quiet places by people no one will ever notice. They don't make headlines. They don't get retold often. They just change what happens next. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.